Welcome back to Zero Books and Repeater Media. This is Adam from Acid Horizon in tandem with our resident Gothic Marxism correspondent, John, aka the Lit Crit Guy. And in a typically accelerationist fashion, we could not wait for October to get started with the spooky season. That is right. Goth Christmas has come early this year. And to that end, we are joined by award-winning writer, broadcaster, curator, and pop cultural deconstructioneer Maria Lewis to talk about her upcoming book, The Graveyard Shift, out soon from Angry Robots. We're welcoming Maria for The Graveyard Shift, a slasher saga that cuts through the horrors of working in the contemporary media ecosystem as much as it's simultaneously slicing through conventions of the slasher genre itself. Just as we get started, so could you introduce yourself, some of the work you've done? I know you've done a lot of work with podcasting as well as curatorial work. Of course, we had this Phantom Never Dies, looking at the early comic book hero work, the award-winning show that gave us a deep dive into Andrew Lloyd Webber's own sort of cosmic mythology, let's say, to put it in a twist like that. Tell us about yourself. What do you do?
So my name's Maria Lewis. I'm a screenwriter. That's my primary job, is writing in the film and television space. But I'm also a novelist. I've written 11 books that basically cover everything from fantasy to Marvel. Mockingbird Strikeout was the one just before this, and Assassin's Creed. I work as pop culture etymologist, which covers, like you mentioned, everything from curation to audio documentaries like Josie and the Podcats with Blake Howard, which was about the 2001 cult film, and The Phantom Never Dies, which was all about the very first superhero, Lee Falk's creation on the comic book page, the ghost who walks, the Phantom, the man in purple. I kind of cover the gambit, really, of anything that's sort of like within the pop cultural space I'm interested in. I'm kind of form agnostic. So whatever the medium is best for that story, that tends to be what I gravitate towards.
I love the term form agnostic, because really the medium is more the message these days than ever before. And help.
Yeah,
on it.
Yeah, I think it also just depends on the story. Like, I started out as a journalist, right? So my background and like beginning in the business was nonfiction. So if I'm working on a piece like that's meant to be a biopic or something like that, that even might be in the narrative space, sometimes the best format for it is nonfiction, and sometimes the best place for it is fiction. And whether that's a novel or whether that's a series or whether that's a film, I'm not really fussy on form. It's kind of like the story will tell you what it needs to be. And that's why having skills that sort of cover a broad range of different mediums becomes quite handy in, the year of our Lord 2023.
Wait, can I ask, like, as a fellow horror aficionado, maybe a good way into talking about The Graveyard Shift would be to talk a little bit about, what was your sort of dark initiation into horror? What's a little bit of your horror history, as it were?
Well, it's my favorite genre, number one. This year, I actually just made my directorial debut on this film called The House That Hungers, which is about a house that eats boys, based on a short story that I wrote of the same name. So horror is kind of like my lifeblood, like, that, desert island genre thing. If you could have one genre, what would it be? For me, it would be horror. The first film I ever saw was Jaws. I'm much too young, when I lived in rural New Zealand and had like never seen the beach. And I was like, what is this? But also things like Mad Monster Party and, Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula growing up were the stories that I gravitated towards. The feeling that you get from stuff that's spooky was what always interested me. But The Graveyard Shift, it's my first pure crime novel, but really the subgenre that it exists within is a slasher. So, this is a bit like sort of my homage to Scream, if you will, but it pays its dues to, John Carpenter's Halloween, but also the sort of like the literary slasher, which really had a big surge in the 70s and early 80s with things like I Know What You Did Last Summer. And it sort of traverses that pop cultural history at the same time as traversing real film history. It's set in Melbourne, Australia, which for your British listeners is basically like mini London, because it was founded as a city post-invasion by people who were from London. So that's kind of the whole energy of the city, is that it's a bit of a wannabe London, but it's also the place where the very first feature film came from, 1906, called The Story of the Kelly Gang, because Australians fucking love Ned Kelly. So it was about trying to sort of simultaneously steer people through the pop culture that they know that's a bit more modern, but also the ideas of film history itself and the tropes that can exist within that, like the final girl trope and all the different, Scream, Randy does that so well, breaking down all the different versions of like what that's supposed to be, virginal, pure, all that kind of stuff. Never show your tits until you go legit, etc., etc. And that was something that I'd always been interested in, and was sort of my big dream was to A, get to write a slasher, but B, find somebody who wanted to publish it, which was Datura, who are an imprint of Angry Robot. So I was stoked, because it's the kind of book I love to read, and I got to put in so many of my influences and experience. And I love hip hop and I love horror. And there's a really interesting space where the two things converge constantly within both genres. So getting to sort of like tap into that as well. It was just honestly a dream book. Like I always wanted to write something like this. And I always also, hopefully, like if it goes well and it doesn't, go down the shitter, I get to write a few more, because you feel like, oh my God, you get one chance to do this. And you're going to put all your references and things that are relevant to that story in there. But you actually can't without it like losing form as a story of itself. So there's just, there's other stuff that you want to add in there. And I'm like, oh, if I get to sequel territory, I'd be really excited, because there's a lot of juicy things sort of like in and around the periphery that I didn't get a chance to explore.
Yeah, I think horrors is such an interesting genre to work with, because it's really good at that kind of like intertextual self-referentiality of like, I'm thinking of like in Halloween 3 Season of the Witch, where in universe they watch Halloween on TV. They watch Carpenter's Halloween, which is like just this kind of like a fun little nod to the audience of like, hey, we know you saw the first one. Like, so it's really fun to kind of get to see you kind of like stack up the points of which there's some that I'm sure like even if people are not super into horror, they'll be familiar with, and then there's just there's some that you've clearly put in just for the ones who, if you know, right?
Yeah, the girlies who know. I mean, even the songs, because the premise of The Graveyard Shift is about a woman called Tinsel Monroe who hosts an overnight radio show, which that slot is called The Graveyard Shift. So metatextual there. But she hosts, the theme of her show is it's a pop culture horror show. So she plays songs from horror movies, scores from horror films, stuff that sits in and around the genre space, interviews those filmmakers, production designers, stuff like that. And the songs that are used in the book that she's playing on this imaginary show tie in lots of times to the themes of the story. And it's like, if the girlies who get it. For instance, there's a song by the Audis on there, which is it's a French rap song, which is used in the feminist cannibal movie Raw, and just sort of like speaking to, horror as a genre has been historically a place where the horror happens to women. Women are the ones the horror happens to. And I think part of the reason Final Girls, and all slashers in general, but Final Girls being one of the defining traits of a slasher, have endured across time, and especially post 1996 when Wes Craven resurrects it and basically restarts the slasher as a genre, is because that idea of getting to see a woman survive at the end of it is deeply appealing to a huge part of the audience, which is women. And so that was something that I'd always been really fascinated by and sort of wanted to examine in the context of a book, because, even on a screenplay, it's like I feel a good horror movie should be right within that 90-minute realm. That's 90 pages. Like, it's really not a whole lot of space. And that is one of my, people ask me all the time, like, oh, are you just going to do film or just do TV or just do whatever? Like, will you give up books? And, maybe that time will come. But one of the reasons I love novel writing so much is because you have so much real estate. smallest case scenario, you have 80,000 words, but the longest book I've written has been like 120, I think 125 that's been published. So that's a lot of space to be able to populate the world with not just the characters and their thoughts and their feelings, but the sounds of their world, the smells of their world, the aesthetic of the cities that they live in and the places that they visit in a way that I think can really elevate horror, because purely by a luxury of form, you just have more time to spend with people.
Maybe we can get into a little bit of like the kind of political and sort of philosophical implications of horror. And obviously the kind of landmark text when it comes to talking about the slasher is a book I find myself talking about all the time, which is Carol Clover's Men, Women, and Chainsaws. Like, whenever I teach that, I always point out to people, I go, oh, this is going to be the thing that makes you want to write about slashers. But Carol Clover already got there, and she got there like 30 years ago. And I guess maybe you can talk a little bit about how you see, because I think Clover quite rightly calls out the kind of the gender dynamics and the essentially kind of conservative politics of the golden age of slashers. Right, the slightly reactionary idea of like you're punishing and policing and disciplining the young. Don't go outside, don't go out to the party, because otherwise, and emerging as it did in like the 80s with that very kind of reactionary turn in cultural politics generally. Yeah, and maybe you can describe a little bit about how you see the Graveyard Shift and maybe more contemporary slashers as like evolving out of that trajectory. And are there still things that have to be kind of unpicked within the form?
100%. I mean, I think so I wrote this novel series called the Supernatural Sisters series for many years, and it was 8 books, and in each novel I focused on a different type of sort of classic mythological monster with a feminist twist. So werewolves, witches, ghosts, mediums, sprites, banshees, stuff like that. And the 2 that I didn't touch were vampires and zombies, because I felt like I had seen so many versions of that story and that those themes explored that I was like, what do I have to say about vampires or zombies? There's nothing left to be said. And then something like Byzantium comes out, the incredible Gemma Arterton, Saoirse Ronan, Neil Jordan joint, which is sort of all about setting up vampirism as this construct of the patriarchy. And then something like M.R. Carey's The Girl with All the Gifts, and it says matriarchal fungus analysis of an ecological like zombie movie. So every time you feel like everything that could be done within a genre has been done, or I feel that way, I'm like, oh, nothing more could be said. Something always comes along and surprises me, makes me feel like an idiot for not seeing it earlier and sooner. And I feel exactly the same way with slashers as well, because I mean, when you watch pop culture, you are always like, women historically have been able to find entry points even if we're not represented, which is why I find that whole argument so often when if there's a film that's got a largely female cast, you always hear those comments from #menonline who are like, where am I in this story? And it's like, come on, man, if like women historically have been able to watch films with largely male casts, written by men, directed by men, made by men for almost 100 years now, you can access our content as well. It's the character oftentimes rather than the actual, the gender or the age or the racial dynamic. But in saying that, when you are watching the genre that you love and the stories that you will love, you are looking for versions of yourself in those stories. And as a biracial woman with big tits, if I'm watching a slasher, I know that I'm the second person dead. Like at best case scenario, the first Black man to survive in a horror movie was Ice Cube and Anaconda, right? So, like you either get to be J-Lo or Ice Cube, or you're fucking Owen Wilson getting deep-throated by the snake. So it had always been that thing where I was very sort of fascinated, especially post as a 90s slasher resurgence started, right? Because you're bang on, like those early slashers, which I find so interesting because John Carpenter did this amazing interview where he was talking about how Halloween for him, the inspiration for that was white flight. Mm-hmm. And like the sort of idea of whiteness and racism within white suburbia. And it's like a subtext within the subtext, right? Because you do not have many characters of color in Halloween. So it's like you really you need him to tell you that. And whether that's in retrospect or whether that's like really right there at the time, that's sort of up to the viewer. But post Scream, and you get into your I Know What You Did Last Summer's, your urban legends, and especially, which was before Scream, but I don't think is too far removed from the slasher subgenre, things like Candyman that are starting to analyze not just like racial dynamics and gender dynamics, but socioeconomic dynamics. Things like Candyman, but also The Candyman by Nia DaCosta as well. So Bernard Rose, obviously the OG, based on a story by Clive Barker, but then factoring in a lot of like real world stuff that was happening in Chicago and the Cabrini Green housing projects at the time, including real murders. And then you have the Nia DaCosta Lego sequel, Candyman, which I think is also brilliant, and expanding that idea even further by factoring in things like the Black Lives Matter movement. There is 100% spaces for reinventions and like resurrections of genre within the horror genre itself, which is, I think, one of the big reasons I've always loved horror is that like it really doesn't bury its lead. Like it says shit like loudly and overtly. You watch a film like Green Room and there isn't really much confusion about the message there, right? Something like Get Out, but also in particular stuff like Nope and Us. You know, Get Out was really like once you know the reveal and once you know the story and you understand what Jordan Peele's trying to do, like, oh wow, fuck, okay, this is interesting and subversive and like literal. But then he starts getting more and more complex and nuanced with things like Us and Nope. And so that was like, you know, for The Graveyard Shift was no question for me. Like I wasn't even an option. It was just like, you know, most of my heroines are diverse in some capacity, whether that's like racially or sexually or even age-wise, having characters in their 50s and 40s. That was always going to be what Tinsel was. She was always going to be a woman of color, because I wanted to be able to talk about the roles of women of color in slashers and within horror itself. And she becomes the perfect vessel to do that as a final girl, but also an unconventional final girl, because oftentimes they can be defined by their family structure. So having her be somebody who's adopted and having this really foundational relationship with her sister is something that was really appealing to me in terms of, if that, you know, what is it? It's final girl singular. So this idea of like there can be one woman survives and one woman that makes it to the end. So sort of analyzing that idea of maybe how you survive is not a solitary thing. It's the core ethics and, you know, message of feminism, which is like all of us together, you know.
Well, the slasher genre itself, in a way, always seems to be based on, yes, as this erasure, this sort of atomization of femininity, and also something that is, I think, very much blurs into the two women who end up being the final girls, the intimacy between fiction and the presentation of crime as fact. Because in a way, what is well, what is the primal scene in a way of the slasher? It's British tabloid newspapers reporting on the Ripper murders, who are mostly, you know, Irish women in time of colonialism moving to the East End. Most of them who knew each other, were part of communities. You know, the communities did line the carts of, I think, Mary Kelly's funeral. She, in a sense, was in depictions later on, for example, Alan Moore's From Hell, the final girl who actually escapes the Ripper. But it's presented as this foundational. It's the foundational. It's like the foundational act which solidifies the image of the slasher, and then, but it also mystifies and at the same time atomizes the feminine. It also solidifies the masculine into this spectral figure of evil. And one of the things, I'm not going to spoil anything about this, but what I love also about The Graveyard Shift is it's just a guy. It's a guy who is as pathetic and petty and status obsessed as any other guy. Yeah, it's not the.
It's a guy I know very well, like that, not like in a literal sense, but it's like somebody that I think. Hopefully, there was a sort of suggestion, like when I was editing the book, I had this a different editor who came on briefly for a period and had suggested the killer be somebody else. And I was like, absolutely not, because that's like, you know, sort of not first rules, but like one of the ways that you construct crime novels is usually come up. You have the easiest way, or they say the way that the GOATs did it, your Agatha Christie's, is you have the killer and you decide on the killer and how that speaks to theme, and then you work your way backwards. And so the killer, I feel, in the best slashers and horror films speaks to the theme of the story. And that's, in this case, how I had designed it. But also, Tinsel is a horror fanatic, is a horror obsessive. It's her career as a horror movie radio show. And her best friend and sister, Pandora, is a true crime fanatic. And her career is, she's studying to be a lawyer, but she runs a true crime blog called Pandora's Box. And so the idea was to have these two women essentially be mirrors of each other, where they're both obsessed with essentially the most horrible thing that could happen to a person, but different reflections of it in true crime space and pop culture space. And that Jack the Ripper stuff you mentioned, what's so interesting about that too is like, those are your first versions and your first iterations of horror. The penny dreadfulization of crime, like slashers are not, it's not Dracula, right? The monster isn't a metaphor. The monster is literally a dude with a knife, in and of itself quite phallic. And the real life inspirations for a lot of those slashers, Scream is obviously based, a very famous case where a killer was, slaughtering people in a college town, and the impact that had on people and how that shifts things. And these things seem so crazy and outlandish until it's happening and you look around you and see the world as it presents, and it's quite horrible. But I also think that's why people have been obsessed with true crime for so long. Like, this isn't a new thing. I think just in the age of podcasting, people think that true crime obsession is new, and it's like, no, again, back to the Penny Dreadfuls, back to Jack the Ripper. Even earlier, you can go back that, like, the death of Caesar. Like, there are true crime stories that people have become obsessed with forever. And I started out my career as a reporter and covering crime and general news. And so you would see that stuff, even if it wasn't a murder per se, armed robberies, small plane crashes, shark attacks, anything that was physically and emotionally devastating. People who haven't experienced that are interested in that. And there's a lot of things to examine and explore about that in a way that, and a lot of guilt too. People feel guilty for being fascinated by those stories and looking up those cases. And it's just, at the end of the day, it's like an extremely human thing. There's not really like a value judgment on it. I think personally, as somebody who's always curious about murders and crimes and things that are happening, and especially unsolved ones, I think are very fascinating.
Maybe it's worth then kind of like unpicking the relationship between true crime and horror as kind of like generic forms and kind of modes of media production, because it's very strange. I often think that there are some people who get very into one and who don't really like the other, and I feel like quite strongly about that. So it's like, it's like I'm really into horror movies. It's what I spend all my time writing and researching. But like true crime has always left me kind of like, I always kind of try to sort of bounce off it, mostly because I go, well, this is true. This is sort of true. So in your experience, what do you see as the relationship between those two forms? And how do you see them kind of like sort of feeding off one another? And are there ways in which, because I think you're right, it's not like it's a new thing, but are there ways in which there are kind of like ethical, kind of moral things that have to be navigated when we turn like actual true events into the kind of fodder for the imaginative catalyst of a horror?
Yeah, well, there's a really interesting case here. It was a dramatic movie, not a horror film per se, called The Stranger, which was about the case of the child abduction and murder of Daniel Morcombe, which was a huge case in Australia for over a decade, I think, until they eventually caught the killer. And the way that they ended up catching the killer was essentially this grand deceit by having police go undercover and create like a fake crime ring, of which they recruited the main suspect into. So he thinks that he's working for this crime ring. And as part of the crime ring, you need to give over details of yourself, similar to how cults like NXIVM and Scientology work, is that you have to give over personal collateral. And in this case, the personal collateral was the fact that he had killed this child. And that got adapted into a film here, although it's not directly, they don't say inspired by. It's like, it's not the Daniel Morcombe story, but everybody kind of knows that that's a story that inspired the film. It stars Joel Edgerton and I always forget his name, the bad guy from Mission Impossible, who's got red hair and the really great voice. I feel like it's Sean Harris. There we go. I feel like that's right. I feel 80% sure that's right. But anyway, he's really great. He plays the killer in it in a very sort of subtle and understated way. And that was a sort of fascinating case study here, because it was a lot of discussion from the family of the victim about how they felt about that film, and this idea of that, that going into it, that people had about the film. You go and watch the movie, and it is less about the actual crime itself. It never shows the crime at all. And the details of it are very specific, like what they talk about. It's all told. None of it's shown, in a way that reminded me a lot of things like Mindhunter, which is inspired by true stories. We know many of the cases, but the actual characters at the core of it, like Holden Ford and Tench, are fictionalized versions of, Robert Resler and John Douglas. And what was so fascinating about Mindhunter is that I'd watched so many true crime inspired shows, both fictional and nonfiction. And there is like almost like I don't want to say torture porn quality to it, but the way that the crime sometimes can be represented and how the women are talked about, who are oftentimes the victims, can be really sensationalized and really tough. And you do get into those ethical and moral quandaries. At a Mindhunter, it was this, again, thing where they were often talking about the crimes rather than showing the crimes. And I think that difference is really really specific and really interesting about where crime in a narrative sense is progressing, or at least I feel maybe some of the better examples within the genre are heading as opposed to the opposite. And, is very, very interested in the I'll Be Gone in the Dark documentary, obviously based on the amazing book of the same name. But in that documentary, one of the things that made the documentary so, so important and fascinating was, yes, okay, you're talking about the story of the Golden State Killer and Michelle's investigation into it. But then the other half of the documentary was analyzing the space and place of women in true crime, fictional and non-fictional, and how those converge, and who's the audience and what is it for and who is it for. Anne Rule did it a lot in her work as well, which was non-fiction. The most famous one being The Stranger Beside Me about Ted Bundy. But there is just something that when I was going to write The Graveyard Shift and sitting down to physically write it, not knowing whether I had a deal, because oftentimes that's how I write books, is you've got a book deal, or that you've pitched on a thing, and so this is the deadline it needs to be. This was something that term from the screenwriting world uses on spec, and so you're just writing it unpaid on the hope that somebody gives a shit. And with The Graveyard Shift, one of my big motivators was I was getting pretty fucking pissed off, to be honest, because I had read there's been a bit of a resurgence of literary slashers lately. I'm not sure if you guys have noticed it. Some of them are really great. I think Stephanie Perkins' There's Somebody Inside My House, which was then adapted into a film for Netflix, produced by James Wan's company, Atomic Monster, which I thought was a fucking, honestly, great adaptation, and Sydney Park's amazing. But a lot of the literary slashers I was reading were about female trauma and female PTSD, and analyzing sort of the structure of the final girl within slashers with horror. And then I would get to the end of the book and I would read the bio, and the bios, like the pseudonyms for the books, they would all be female pseudonyms, but the books would actually be written by men who had taken female pseudonyms. And, one, fine, whatever. Two, okay, this is getting interesting. So getting to like my third or fourth book, where someone has taken either a gender neutral pseudonym or a female pseudonym, and then specifically written not just one novel, but several about female trauma and what it is to be a woman in this genre space and female PTSD. And I was just like it was really starting to jerk my gherkin, because I was like, fuck, if we don't even get to write about ourselves in this space, this was so frustrating. And there's something that really just sort of transcends the form of like, that you understand the person who's gone through the thing, can talk to the thing in a way that there's a book that came out at the moment called Bright Young Woman by Jessica Knoll that sort of analyzes, again, this idea of the women who are the victims and these like bright, brilliant serial killers who are such geniuses and these, sort of male archetypes. It's kind of like, she's sort of talking towards a fictionalized Ted Bundy type. But those sort of stories were so interesting because it was just like, it's one thing to think anybody can write anything, but when you're specifically talking about female trauma and what it means to be a woman and to go through that, there's just a point where I'm just like, where are the stories about us by us? And the lived experience that you have as a woman walking home at night with their keys wedged between their knuckles, sending your location to a friend if you're going out on a date and saying, hey, babe, this is where I'm going to be. Or like, this is this car number plate that's weirding me out. Or like being suspicious on anyone who shows up to your door, especially if it's a cop, asking for those IDs. Just these little things that you navigate the world with, these little mechanisms, like not walking home with headphones at night. Like my best friend, I was living with him and his partner for a while, and he went out for this jog, excuse me, at like 10 o'clock at night. He was about to leave the house. I was like, oh, where are you going? He's, oh, I'm going for a jog. And I was like, God damn it. And I was so mad because like I love to jog and I love the night. But one thing I would never do is jog at night because I'm out here trying to, stay sexy and not get murdered, to quote my favorite murder. And I was like, God damn it, I'm so jealous. And he goes, you know what? You're going to make him even more jealous. And he put his headphones in his ears. And he's like, he was listening to a podcast about the Zodiac Killer. And I was just like, oh, man, this represents all the things of like the limit between like what he can do and what I can do. And being conscious of being like not wanting to ever have to change your life for the worst, but being aware of situations and percentages and likelihoods of like, if you are a woman living alone and you choose a ground floor apartment, your odds of being murdered go up 15%, all that kind of stuff. It's just, I wanted to read stories in the genre about us by us, and feel that lived experience in the way that I know so many women, including myself, live every day.
I think when you were talking about like that distinction between the horror and true crime and the sort of like the kind of gray area that the Venn diagram between those two things kind of exists within, made me think of I used to teach something on slashers, and we'd use Hannibal. We'd use Thomas Harris as an example, and Hannibal is like
have a Silence of the Lambs tattoo, like say less. Red Dragon is one of my favorite books.
Hannibal's like this kind of suave, urbane European intellectual, and so the thing that we would always end the session with is a clip from Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. So because really the problem with Hannibal, and this is true of the Mads Mikkelsen show, which I adore deeply, is the kind of aestheticization of violence, right? The body of the victim becomes the beautiful spectacle that you get to kind of admire Hannibal and Will's kind of art through. And all of this goes back to like Edgar Allan Poe's famous thing of, there is no more poetical sight than a beautiful dead woman. So if you actually, and that was the bit that always got students when you put on Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, which is a deeply unpleasant film and like really kind of strips the sort of glamour off the slasher, who either becomes like the super genius, like Hannibal, or becomes the kind of the almost supernatural shape, which is how they describe Michael Myers as you get into the back half of the early. We won't go into those. They're not amazing. But so like I think it's really valuable to have this idea of like, actually no, it can just be a guy, right? It can just be.
Yeah. And I think the other thing is like this idea that like, there's always this discussion about how slashers are dangerous because they inspire killers and things like that, or they're not respectful because they're inspired by real murders or it's representing real murder. But what were werewolves at their core? They were a way for people to talk about, I mean, they're real, but they're also a way for people to talk about serial murder. They're a way for people to reckon with the idea of terrifying, monstrous, beastly crimes. What were vampires representing in stories and pop culture, this idea of a loved one who doesn't look like themselves anymore, what disease and pandemic can do to people. It's like monster stories represent horrible things that happen in the world as much as serial killers and, killers, masked killers in movies do. Godzilla, for goodness sakes, right? So I think there's horror as a genre has been one of the sort of most targeted in terms of the things that it can do. But I also think but I don't want to say rom-coms, because I think rom-coms are like very self-aware and like subtextually like very keen on the constraints of the genre in the same way that horror is, but romance and romance melodrama can be just as damaging to the world as this idea of violent films, but yet nobody ever talks about that because horror is an easier subject that you can be scared by. But it was really interesting when I was researching The Graveyard Shift. Obviously, I had a lot of contacts from my days covering crime, but one of the people I interviewed researching the book was this guy called Louis B. Schlinger, who worked at the behavioral science unit at the FBI studying serial killers. And because, this book is about a serial and a spree killer. So yes, okay, it's fictional and it's a slasher and it's hyper real and all those things. But I found that even within my fantasy work, the things that can be grounded in reality heighten even and make the rest of the book feel more grounded and more relatable and more textured and more authentic and organic. So I was interviewing him about serial killers for this book, and he said that one of the biggest sort of like misconceptions, if you will, or things that like always like rubs him the wrong way is that serial killers pop culturally are often represented as geniuses. And he was like, oftentimes they're just opportunistic idiots. And that's more realistic of what a serial killer is. And the reason they get away with it, at least back in his day, was often because they were transient, as in they were truck drivers or they were people who were mobile specifically. So that the longer you're staying in a certain geographical area, the more likely it is that you're going to get caught. And I just found his analysis of that, of serial killing being a compulsion and a planned compulsion rather than something that's orchestrated by geniuses. Really, really intriguing. It's like not everybody is an Ed Kemper. Oftentimes they're a Richard Speck. And, sort of trying to find a balance between that when you're talking about a fictional killer and kind of construct why somebody might be doing this and the reasons is it's a tricky line to walk, but it's also, I think, one that's really important. A lot of times the masked killers in movies, a lot of times, the ones where I think they're the best, I mean, even Friday the 13th, which is pretty nasty towards women, but the constraint of Jason Voorhees, once you get past the sequel, the hockey mask has become iconic for a reason. Freddy Krueger, Ghostface, Michael Myers, obviously, Leatherface, they have become iconic for a reason. And part of the reason they work in the story is that they speak to the theme of what's happening up top as well as down below. And that is why when you're trying to craft a serial killer like the Grim Reaper in the case of The Graveyard Shift, it's really tough because it's like, it's got to have a cute outfit. It's got to speak to theme. It's got to be something when they're eventually unmasked that it doesn't feel like a disservice to the story. And there's a lot of things to juggle. They've also got to feel like a villain that's really worthy of your heroine. You've got to feel like they're an antagonist deserving of the protagonist, so that when they make it through the crucible of the events of the narrative, that they come out the other side in a way that there always has to be a degree of earn to it. Not that, but if you've seen Cabin in the Woods, you understand the structure of the harbinger of doom, that there has to be a degree of choice and then willingness to fight.
I really love your point about the not giving the serial killers far too much intellectual credit, because when this happens, it's always after they've been caught, and we go, "How did you do this?" I mean, occasionally, I think it was Richard Ramirez says, or was it Ted Bundy? One time, you just forget where your wrench is. But the worst example of this is there's a book by the Moors murderer, Ian Brady, and he's doing this analysis of serial killers. Listeners, don't bother reading it. It's the most I got about 2 pages. It's the most pompous thing ever. It's the most, I am like the Marquis de Sade. Well, the Marquis de Sade didn't kill anyone. He just wrote a bunch of porn in his jail cell. Difference. It's
And worse, honestly, last thing I want to read is poetry, let alone from your jail cell. Like, fuck me.
But there's also something on again, as John was talking about this, as we're all going through this idea of distinction between true crime and horror. But the same, it feels like there's also a distinction within true crime itself, in the sense that sometimes the true in true crime can be presenting a truth, from below, elevating certain stories. But it could also mean true in the same way that in reality TV, reality means reality.
Well, you see it with particularly the coverage of true crime in America is very different to other parts of the world, very different from even here in Australia. We have really strict defamation laws here. And so things that can be covered and can't be covered, you not only you really have to prove the shit that you're publishing, not to say that sensationalist stuff doesn't happen. Hello, we have the Daily Mail here too. But the stuff that's covered in America and the way that it's covered is truly like bananas, because it was like I came up as a journalist in the sort of like last 10 years of print journalism, when newspapers still mattered and was still a thing. And the rules that you are taught, and like you have to go through all this training, you have to learn shorthand, you have to like go through court training on how to cover court, all this different stuff. And then the morals and ethics and all that. And, 9 times out of 10, that's like people sort of making that shit up on the fly. And there's always this sort of like shift between people judging ambition with having good editors and having good bosses who are like making the right choices about, do you go on a death knock? Do you not? All of that kind of stuff. But things like, I'm not sure if you guys followed the Moscow murders case out of the University of Idaho. But the way that case was covered and the way that people were, revealing addresses and faces of innocent people who had nothing to do with stuff on TikTok because of a psychic thing. You know what I mean? Like, or just because somebody didn't like the way somebody looked in a video where 2 of the victims were picking up their takeaway food. And these people's lives are ruined forever in a way that's really, truly horrible and terrifying, and one of the scariest true crimes of it all, because the collateral on things like these now is so much wider and broader than it ever was before. Not to say that it hasn't been bad. JonBenet Ramsey case is a pretty good example of that, but it has just been really like interesting and terrifying to watch in the social media age, how true crime as entertainment, but also true crime as an activation, as a hobby, is something that has just become, really prevalent. There's
this kind of like distributed paranoia, right? So it's like you see the CCTV and it's like, well, that guy's vibes looked weird to me. So now I need to like, and I think this idea of like, we feel ourselves always constantly surveilled anyway. And so there is something kind of quite libidinally thrilling about getting to be the one who might kind of decode or the web of images and video that might be out there now.
And there have been examples where that's been done successfully too, which I think is part of everybody wants to be the next, like,
you want to be the next one who kind of cracks things open. But exactly. I do genuinely think there is this, I think this is maybe one of the things that I find kind of like quite odd about contemporary true crime, in that quote unquote true sense, where it becomes this like media, like multimedia kind of meta narrative that sort of unfolds out from this original like horrific event. And instead of actually having the chance to sort of like reckon with that, we suddenly find ourselves like willing participants, wanting to continue the spectacle, wanting the next awful thing to happen.
Yeah, there was a really great piece, I want to say it was in the New York Times, about the Moscow murders, and how this one particular true crime journalist has essentially become a celebrity because of his coverage. And his coverage has been, like, not sensationalist, really like consistent. He's been on the ground since the early days of the crime, but just because people were so fascinated with that case, his reporting and I guess the consistency and steadiness of it has made him a celebrity, where they were talking about how he gained hundreds of thousands of followers, and now he basically chairs his own broadcasts on the case and things like that. And so it is really interesting to watch the multimedia meta-narrative, to steal your phrase, happen around it, which again, like in The Graveyard Shift, Tinsel works in broadcasting, and her sister has an awareness of it. And so those were things that, yes, I had experience in radio, but it was also, I was shadowed a friend of mine, Hal Lotakefu, who's one of the one of the pioneers of hip hop in Australia. And he used to host an overnight radio show called The Hip Hop Show for 15 years. And so I shadowed him on a few of those to sort of like understand the mechanics of how that works when you're in a studio by yourself overnight, and was able to like funnel as much of my real world media experience into the story and into Tinsel's story as it was unfolding, as well as all of the fictional aspects. It's always the balance, isn't it? Like trying to balance the true and the crime, trying to balance the enjoying aspects of a slasher, which what people I think are drawn to partly about slashers is the survivalist stuff, this idea of trying to outwit, outlast, outplay, to quote Survivor itself. But that is the thing that like people, they want to imagine themselves in that scenario and how they would do it. And I think like trying to balance all of those so that one element doesn't feel too heavily weighted against the others, so that the serial killer stuff feels true and realistic, but it never comes at the expense of the character work. And the character work is never at the expense of the real world environment, which in this case is a radio station within a major Australian city.
It seems like there's all of this culminating around the same function, even within hip hop and actually in adjacent genres like jungle, which is the social realism aspect presents the experience as one of navigating through anxiety, but there's that spark there which makes it charged with the desire for more. Even with true, I mean, it's probably easier because we're all sort of plugged into these desiring circuits, these dopamine circuits of social media. But is it for you a process of presenting the anxiety of the characters and for the characters, and making both charged with the desire to progress through this narrative? And there's that sense, yeah,
I mean, the hip hop horror, also like that subgenre, for people who don't know, it's oftentimes referred to as horrorcore. But I remember being really into one of the early Gravediggers album, which is just a horrorcore group and truly probably one of the pioneers of the genre. But they essentially talk about the songs are through the character lens of different killers, like Freddy Krueger type killers, and people having a real problem with that and feeling quite confronted by that. But the reality is also that is a reflection of their experience and the experiences they grew up in lower socioeconomic conditions, where the idea of prey and predator, particularly being between the police or any forms of governmental authority and young men of color specifically, and women of color, is extremely prevalent. And so this becomes the vessel for their storytelling. You also saw it a lot with like DMX's work. He had a bunch of songs within the horrorcore genre, but I mean, there's so many. MF Doom, like there's a Graveyard Shift playlist that you can go and jump into and like really have a great time outside of MC Hammer's Addams Family Groove and, Fresh Prince and their Nightmare on Our Street, which is a song with more words maybe than any song ever. I swear it goes for 12 minutes as he recounts the plot of like every friggin' like Freddy Krueger movie. It's wild. But I think that's really fascinating because then the line starts to get blurred. It's like with video games and violence, how people are always having that discussion about the difference between inspiration or the difference between voyeurism and reality and how that works and what inspires people to do one thing and the other. And so, being able to talk about that in the book with the whole hip hop and horror overlap was deeply appealing to me also because I felt like I hadn't seen it. You know, I'm always trying to do something that, yes, okay, slashers, everybody knows what they are. I'm not the first person to invent a slasher. I'm not the 50,000th person. But that idea of analyzing how horror and hip hop interact and what that means, and how that can be interpreted now, because that subgenre has only continued. There are like even more horrorcore acts than ever before, because horror has also expanded with things like Shudder, streaming services that are specifically dedicated to it. They're even more subgenres than ever before, because horror is quite cheap to make in the film and TV, or specifically in the film space. TV horror is actually quite expensive, but film horror, you can get a pretty good horror movie put together for like $2 or $3 million and make that budget back times 10, right? And also then have growth for your audience, because horror is word of mouth and people find it and they discover it and they talk about it themselves. I found all of that really interesting and something that I wanted to explore in the vessel of people who could appreciate both, or people who enjoyed the storytelling of both. Bone Thugs and Harmony, who are kind of considered maybe like more, what, you know, like it's Bone Thugs and Harmony. It's like people associate, well, I associate with Mariah Carey, or like that sort of peak R&B smooth rhythm era. They had a song called Mo Murder, which is all about that stuff. So it's just like, Eminem also had a bunch, but his were very close to more like describing domestic violence situations than a separation of storytelling per se. But I just find all of that it's storytelling in one way or the other, and it's just a different mechanism to do it, and a more, in many ways, aesthetically pleasing mechanism, because if the production's good and the beat's good, you want to go on that journey.
I think if people want a kind of companion book to The Graveyard Shift, it really made me think about Robin Means Coleman and Mark Harris's book, The Black Guy Dies First. Which is like a non-fiction history of Black horror in the context of contemporary American politics. And there's a point that they make right towards the end of the book, where they say that Black horror is Black history, right? So there is already this like this interstitial space where the actual real world horrors that we all kind of exist in become kind of these. They are like phantasmatically, imaginatively projected into the point of horror production, and they are this and this is what I think is kind of interesting, is like horror is like an ethical or kind of like moral questioning kind of media space, because it allows people to confront these often very real and even kind of inchoate anxieties of like the contingency of modern life, the unpredictability of violence, the kind of systemic unfairness of like, as like you were talking about, of like being a person of color in the inner cities, where like poverty and deprivation are kind of rife, and violence from the police can arrive at any second, and they become these things which are kind of like staged and sort of worked through. And I really love the point that you made about like the fun is like, the thrill of it is like, can I survive?
Yeah. There's a movie out at the moment that's also a companion piece to the companion piece, called The Blackening, which I'm not sure if you guys have seen, but like a really like funny, great, like that was developed from a skit about, it's a horror movie, a horror comedy, but every character is Black. And the tagline of the movie is "We can't all die first," which I think is so funny and just like so cutting and really like hits straight to it. But you know, like the difference too, I think, yes, there's Candyman 1, and then there's technically Candyman 4. There's a Bill Condon joint in between, and then Candyman 3. Let's not talk about it. But if you look at the two types of storytelling that both of those Candymans are doing, it's really fascinating, because the complexities of like gender and sexuality, and the Black man to white woman narrative that's sort of explored in the first, and the urban city dynamics. Fast forward, 20 plus years to Nia DaCosta's Candyman, and when they're talking about institutionalized and systemic racism and like state justified murder that's filmed and discussed and dissected, and where fear is as much the weapon as a baton or a chokehold, is really, really interesting. Like the not just interesting, but like important and significant. And the people sort of working within that space, it's just like freaking blowing my mind at the moment. There's also so many great female body horrors where like Titanic kind of does it. I mean, it does and it doesn't, because it's like, okay, she fucks a car. So like, you're removing it one step back. It's not exactly like you don't have like your Alien, bit more, I would say using Alien to describe subtlety, but the idea of the chest burster essentially being reverse rape, but the fears that women have about pregnancy and the body horror of that idea. There have been a bunch of films about that recently, and even postnatal depression that I think are really like fascinating. And also the age of internet dating, like Horror Afresh. I don't know if you saw that, but that's incredible. And then this other film called Run Baby Run. But there being this like horror is essentially a mirror to society and what we're going through at various times. And it's often a mirror of the filmmakers and the people who are telling that story. And that's why I think it's really engaging. Something that it might take you 10 episodes to do, you can do in horror quite quickly and quite efficiently, I think.
I think that's a beautiful way to round things off. I mean,
Right.
The Graveyard Shift is out now. Get it from Penguin Random House. Do not get it from the Evil Site, unless you have to. It goes Evil Site maybe. It is out from the tour from Angry Robots. Maria Lewis, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thank you. And I was going to say there's an audiobook too, which is very exciting for me because I've never had one of my books get made into an audiobook before. So it's narrated by the incredibly talented Australian actress Taryn Ryan. So if you want to get hold of that, it's the same place you would usually buy things like that you can access.
Beautiful. All right, signing off. Catch you later, folks.
Thank you. Thanks for such great in-depth questions.
We appreciate your support of the imprint and the channel. Subscribe to Zero Books Today on Patreon. Your material support helps us to promote a variety of perspectives on the left. Also, discover the many titles, new and old, that Zero has curated. Navigate to any of the links in the show notes to extend your support.